Well, good morning if you are somewhere along the Pacific Ocean. Good afternoon if you are here in New York City or somewhere on the Atlantic Ocean, on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. And good evening to people in Europe and Africa, and good morning to people around the world. And especially good evening to people listening in Austria, where my guest joins me tonight. Um, I occasionally, as listeners know, make full disclosure, and full disclosure is this is one of my favorite opera singers. And I've been very eager to have her join me for a while. I'm very happy that Barbara Daniels, soprano, is joining me from her home in Austria. And I will say officially welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. As you know, Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to fans all around the world. So, Barbara Daniels, officially welcome. It's great to see you.
Great to see you, Fred. We finally hooked up.
We did. So, the first thing I want to say is that Barbara Daniels' career at the Metropolitan Opera and mine basically overlapped. And we were there. I started a little before I left a little before you, but I saw many Barbara Daniels performances in the wings on the stage, from the front of house, from wherever I was. And she was always great. And Barbara, I don't know if you remember this, but my retirement date, when I chose what day to retire, I basically looked around at what the Met was doing that day, which was February 6th of 1988. And it was the last La Boheme of a run that you did with Mirella Freni, Luciano Pavarotti, Jonathan Summers as Marcello. You were Musetta. A young baritone was named Thomas Hampson. We became very good friends as Schaunard, and Gwyn Howell as Colline, and Carlos Kleiber conducting.
Yep.
And I had, for my retirement, the choice of that or Siegfried. And Siegfried ends with a great bang. So I thought maybe that would be an interesting opera, but it was too late to do a party after that. Whereas Bohème ended earlier, and Pavarotti gave a party, and it was really wonderful. And you were a wonderful part of that performance. And what I did on that day, because it was my last performance, I decided to dress up as one of the people in the crowd for the Act Two, where Musetta comes out and sings. And so I was in the crowd. I watched you from behind that night, which is something I've never done before. What memories do you have of that rather gala, not because of me, but gala cast and conductor, because it was so rare for Kleiber to come to the Met? Freni and Pavarotti were paragons, and a young Thomas Hampson and so forth. Talk about that night, because you were central to the success of that performance.
Well, to tell you the truth, it's been quite a while. And to think back, that particular cast, especially conducted by Kleiber, and we went on to sing with him later on tour with Freni. I think it was not Pavarotti, it was Peter, what? I want to say Dvorak, but that was not his name.
Yes.
It was. Okay.
Yeah.
I remember. And it was a marvelous experience, except that Carlos was always disappearing, whereas in New York, he was there the whole time. And it was a wonderful evening. It could be, however, if you were watching from behind that night, you might have seen that my underskirt under my costume let go. It was loose. It dropped. I was up on a table. I felt it fall. Someone from the chorus must have held it, because when I was then helped down off the table to go forward and do the rest of my act as Musetta, the underskirt disappeared somewhere. I think it was that performance. So you might have noticed that. I don't know.
Yes. And I want to mention something I meant to tell our listeners. The connection today to Austria is a little scratchy, so that Barbara has a much more gorgeous voice than it may sound today. But I'm very grateful to have you here in whatever way the technology permits.
Okay.
Um, I'm going to tell you a story from that night.
Uh-oh.
That, this run was of 5 performances, and this was the last of the 5. And because the Met owed me many months of time, and I never had a chance to take time off because I worked all the time. I loved it. Um, I got myself a little job at the Teatro Colón in Buenos Aires. And in the January and the December before, I was in Argentina working at that theater, and therefore not at the rehearsals as I normally would have been for this Bohème. And
Mhm.
a memo had been put out that because Maestro Kleiber was considered shy, standoffish, whatever word we want to use, that nobody was to talk to him except a couple of designated people. I never saw the memo. This was before email. They sent a piece of paper around and I never saw it. My habit as being performance manager was to speak to all the artists and to let them know that I'm there if you need something and so forth. And the day that I got back, which was the day before the opening, I went to Maestro Kleiber and I said, Maestro, I'm Fred Plotkin. I'm the performance manager. We're so happy to have you at the Metropolitan Opera. Is there anything that I can do for you to make your time here easier? And he said, yes, let's have dinner. And I said, well, that would be fine. It would be an honor. I said, but why? He said, no one talks to me here.
Oh,
He said, I walk down the hallway and people look away. And I said,
strange.
I
Very
don't
strange.
know why, but that was the reason.
Wow.
What, in your experience, because you are an artist and you worked with him, what was he like in terms of artistic collaboration?
He was always just a little bit different, what he expected, especially in Japan when we were performing there. Uh, Peter was having his problems, and Franny was playing mother to him. Um, we all had a grand time. But I remember he was very sensitive about sound, and you found the left hand going up a lot, the left hand going up a lot. And I thought, wow, I'm going to have to sing this in triple pianissimo here pretty soon. It was at the rehearsals. So I figured let's just wait and find out what happens when it really, when we go to town.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the performance, it was him. It was just him. There was no left hand. But at all the rehearsals, I don't know, he was trying to save my voice. Maybe he was upset that Peter was sort of not in such good shape. I don't know. But it was always a wonderful collaboration with him and with Mirella. She was somehow his hookup with her, smoothed over everything else. And then, of course, there was the great rumor that he was busy off visiting geishas or whatever. Who knows? Carlos was a mystery to many of us, and you could never quite tell where Carlos was, but he was there for every performance, and it was exciting.
And I'm just remembering the name is Peter Dvorsky, was the
More,
name of the tenor. Peter Dvorsky.
yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Now, if my memory serves, and I have a very good memory, the first time I heard Barbara Daniels sing was not in Cincinnati, where you had studied, but the year later in Palm Beach, Florida, when you were singing Susanna. Is that correct? In
Ooh.
Lady Figaro?
Ooh, that was actually, I mean, my first soprano role
Mm-hmm.
thrown to me quickly, like I can't explain. Jim DeBlaise was one of the greatest opera directors and directors of the pieces that I performed with him, whether in the chorus in small parts, working up as a young artist in that program at that time. He really gave me some of my very first chances. And there was a cancellation for the Susanna, and they were on tour with Norman Tradle.
Mm-hmm.
And well, you better believe it. I learned that part in English in 3 weeks.
Wow.
Coached by my wonderful Dr. Robert Evans, my teacher's husband. The two of them just beat it right into me. And I was off and running, but let me tell you, it was tough. Carol Neblett was the Countess, and she was having none of it. She was calling me and telling me what to do this and what to do that and this. And actually, I should be grateful to her for all of her tips, because God knows she was wonderful. But Norman was a little bit of an issue. I mean, you could never tell in what shape he would enter the stage. And I remember at the very end of the opera, I was supposed to be picked up by him and swung around. He told me, now pick me up and swing me around. So I grabbed him. It was the end of the opera. I grabbed him at the minute that I squeezed his rather still muscular but very bony skeleton to my own body.
Yep.
An entire cloud of cigarette smoke came out of his mouth. He had been smoking backstage, and he also smelled like other things. I say what? But his performance was fantastic. He had a great deal of patience with me, considering that I was taking over a role that had already been, wow, was it Joy Davidson? I can't remember who canceled. How do you like that? It was just for me frightening, and it was being thrown onto the stage in one of the wildest situations. And that was it. I mean, I was a soprano. There was no turning back.
And also, by some estimates, the two longest roles in opera are Susanna in Le Nozze The Marriage of Figaro and Elsa in Lohengrin, are considered the most notes.
Really?
More than Grunemann and Parsifal. There are certain very long roles, but apparently the big two are Elsa and Susanna.
Well, I can't say that I missed it, or I don't feel sentimental about having never been asked, but I think Wagner was not really my thing totally, and I am positive I would not have been a very good Elsa. I mean, it never sort of tickled me in the way that a role would tickle me. I would have thought that Butterfly was one of the longest and you know.
She definitely, and one of the hardest. And Salome is a shorter opera, but it's a long sing.
Yes.
But apparently in total notes, it's Elsa and Susanna are numbers 1 and 2, depending who you ask.
Okay.
Now, you bring up something that I was about to get to anyway. You're joining me from your home in Austria.
Mm-hmm.
And you are, like many singers of your generation, someone who's an American who had wonderful training in America, in Cincinnati, which is one of our great schools. CCM, Cincinnati Conservatory of Music. But like many Americans of your generation, you went to Europe. Thomas Hampson went to Europe, Cheryl Studer, many went to Europe. Mm. And you, Marilyn Horne, before you went to Europe, and you began, if I'm correct, at the Tyrolean State Theater in Austria. And then you were in Kassel in Germany and Cologne in Germany, and really had a long period in the Austrian and German system. Talk about that. You were a very young artist, and you left home, you left America, you lived in Europe, you had to adapt to the system, which is, to me, not onerous, but it's a different system from the United States.
Totally.
And talk about that experience, please.
When you think about situations where you have a long time to sort of throw your options back and forth. At the end of my schooling in Cincinnati, and I got a master's there, and I was sort of killing time, actually. I had changed teachers. I became a soprano very fast. And I think both of the Evanses, Lucille and Robert Evans, were holding their breath that I would not continue to study for a doctorate and would not apply for some teaching job somewhere. I was thinking about going to New York. I was thinking about it. But I got involved in early years through the very first teacher that I had at Ohio State, Irma Cooper, who sent me to Europe. She says, "You're going." This was back in 1969. I was one of the first people at the American Institute of Musical Studies, then in Freiburg, Germany. It moved on then to Austria in later years. It's still there. I'm very thankful to them. They gave me the boot in the right direction. I ended up in Europe with very little money. This teacher gave me enough money to stay there. He said, you stay there until you get a job. And I was picked up by the Hollander agency at that time, not under Hollander's management. He was one of the junior partners, became then the head of the Hollander agency. And he sent me everywhere. I mean, I auditioned every week somewhere. He got trained, the accommodations paid for, and everything was on the up and up. But I didn't get any of those jobs. And boy, am I glad, because they'd have killed me. The German system is a much longer system. You have constant operas running, repeats, takeovers. If you're in one Fach, they can get you to sing everything from screaming Marianne in Rosenkavalier, which I was threatened to have to do in Cologne, to Butterfly and takeovers, because that's your Fach. Whatever your Fach was, mine was a mess. I think it was lyric soprano with angrenzende Partien coloratura. That would have really spread me quite thin. I didn't get any of those first auditions. I ended up going on a train to Innsbruck. The sun was going down. I opened my eyes. I'd been sleeping, and I looked up the sun going down behind the Alps, and I thought, oh, if there's a God, let me get this job. And I got it. Mm-hmm. And they took awfully good care of me. They had a long season. There was a lot to do. My German was non-existent. I mean, really. But the first piece I had to learn was Fior. Everything.
Yeah.
In German. I mean, but I had an American colleague, Linda Trotter. I'm not even sure that Linda's still alive, and she was in the theater, and she was great. She was my Dorabella, and between her and the intendant, who was a great support for me in those 1.5 to 2 years of singing in Innsbruck, I got through Fiordiligi in German, Traviata in German, and then they gave me Traviata was a surprise and a gift, and Fiordiligi as well. But in the following years, in the German system, I picked them both up in Italian. That was a treat. And I kept a great friend, Rosalinda, in Fledermaus. I auditioned for something, for the support of the local animal shelter. And I sang something that my teacher had said, oh, you got to sing that. That's lots of fun. Sing the Charlist. That's fun. That's fun. Oh, I sang it, and he said, you know the rest of the opera? And I said, no, but I can learn it. And I did. And 450 performances later, well, she stayed a good friend. Violetta stayed a very good friend. Musetta and Fiordiligi for a long time.
So I want to bring up a couple of things for listeners who don't. At the time, in regional German opera houses and Austrian opera houses, many operas were sung in German rather than the original language. My very first Carmen, believe it or not, was Christa Ludwig in German. And when I later heard it in French, it sounded strange to me because I thought the opera was in German. And therefore, you would be singing Violetta in German and Fiordiligi in German.
Yep.
And it raises questions about why companies did that, but basically it was the local language of the people hearing the opera.
They wanted to understand. It was something I had never, I mean, in the big American theaters, I was born of the generation with no subtitles or overtitles. And over here, I realized that they wanted to understand. And they would be very critical, especially if you were an Ausländer, if your German sucked. And I was coached very well. I never got booed. My German got better. I used a lot of strange words in talking with people because it came out of the operas, how that is. It was preferred, let's say, in the smaller theaters. The minute you went to a Class B or Class A house, now Castle was the next job, and I learned a heck of a lot there. But they did everything in the original language because it was, I think, I only remember it as being excellent orchestra. It still has an excellent orchestra. Everything was done in the original language, with the exception of Russian pieces. Piquedam and things like that were done in German at that time. As we know now, they will be sung in Russian. Although there are some fights about that at the present time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you were schooled in a role, let's take Violetta for now in La Traviata, in German, and knew her in German, and then ultimately, certainly at the Met, I heard you do it, and you've done it elsewhere in Italian. What happens in the brain and in the voice and in rehearsal when you have a role in your head in German, let's say, when it's not a German role? How do you adapt? Is your Violetta in Italian different from your Violetta in German?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it came to me much later when I taught, which God knows I had never planned to do in my life and had no pedagogical credentials. But boy, did I learn the difference between a throat, a tongue, a language. As my teacher once said, it's not that the Italians sing so much better. They have the better language. Well, I mean, she meant it honestly. And it is a fact that some languages are more colorful, not so white, not so straight. The German language lives in a different place. My teacher used to say, oh my gosh, she said, you sound totally different in German. I found that out by teaching myself. I found it out with my daughter. My daughter was raised with, well, two and then a third language. Third language, if you can call the difference between Austrian in Tyrol and Hoch German in Germany, where she studied then later. She speaks perfect American English. She sounds almost just like me. It's a different sit to the voice. When she speaks Tyrolean, the accent is different, the colors are different, and if she switches to Hochdeutsch, there is a difference. And for me, I think I knew so little of the language to speak it that it did not encumber me switching from the one into the other. I was just glad to finally have it in a language that would probably be hired more often in more places. Yeah.
Well, all kinds of questions pop in my head, but for example, sempre libera, is that immer frei? How would you say that in German? And how, it's not the same number of syllables and notes.
I don't know whether it was immer frei sein, immer frei sein.
Fine. Okay. Yeah.
But you have all of these terrible stop and start vowels, and they don't want to hear it all slewed together. Immer frei sein, immer frei sein. That's tough. When I think about it, I'm glad that I've forgotten the rest of it because I couldn't say one other word.
I have a dear American friend. He's not an opera in any way. He's from North Carolina, but has lived most of his life in Europe, and for a very long time lived in Barcelona.
Oh.
And he learned Spanish first, but because it's Barcelona, they prefer Catalan. And he was with a partner for a long time who was Catalan and learned Catalan. And when he and I would walk around Barcelona, he would speak in Catalan to some people, Spanish to other people, and English to me.
Oh, you got it.
He would say, I'm getting exhausted and confused because I noticed that his voice, and he's not a singer at all, would be at a different pitch in the different languages. And that he just got tired because the voice got so taxed. Somehow his Spanish was higher, his Catalan middle, and his English was lower.
Yeah.
And if your daughter speaks Tyrolean German, Hochdeutsch, which is the Hanoverian German, and American English, that must be a similar thing.
It's very similar. By the way, she's a violinist, and she is playing Hanover right now as we speak.
Yep.
It's the tongue. It's the tongue. It's the smile that you notice in the Latino languages, Spanish, Italian, even French. There is this smile. You see the teeth. In German, oft und die Zunge ist hinter die untere Zähne. I could never figure that out, but I drove my students crazy trying to tell them there is another way to roll an R. I had so many students could not roll an R. Bravo, bravo. No, not bravo, bravo. I mean, I'm probably spitting all over the television here. It was a long procedure, and you're right. You get very tired keeping that tongue where it has to be to sound. Now, nobody is ever going to say, "Oh, I'm German." Never. I would get accused of being Swedish, some other, but never. I mean, it's the color in the voice. Maybe it's that Midwestern nose. I have no idea, but it has an awful lot to do with what you do with your tongue and your teeth and the inside of your mouth that makes each language tiresome if you're flipping them back and forth like pancakes, your poor friend.
When I'm in France and speaking my not perfect French, what I always find interesting is that the French think I'm Italian. They don't think I'm an American, because apparently the way I form my vowels and maybe certain consonants seems to them to be Italian. Whereas in Italy, the people say to me, "Your Italian is excellent, but you're not quite from here, are you? You're from somewhere else." And I'll say, "Yes, beyond the Alps." I don't even go further than that. But it's interesting because language and the way we speak it, even if we're sovereign in terms of grammar, becomes a marker of all kinds of things.
Oh yeah. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. It is.
And, as I said, first encountered you. Now you reminded me it was in English as a very young Susanna. I was a teenager, and, it may have been my second marriage of Figaro by then. But then I re-encountered you when you came to the Metropolitan Opera. And your debut was September 30th of 1983. And I was already working at the Met. And I was a good friend and still am of your Mimi. It was Catherine Malfitano.
Yep.
And your conductor was Eugene Cohn,
Yep.
someone I'd love to have on this program. Eugene looks eternally youthful, but he's had one of the longest careers in opera.
Love him. Love him.
He worked for many, many years as I worked with Luciano Pavarotti. I would say that Eugene worked with and for Luciano Pavarotti, and was his preferred conductor, as he often worked with Placido Domingo. And Neil Shikoff was the tenor. And you were in this very famous production that's still there, the Franco Zeffirelli production of La Boheme, as Musetta. And that was the first show I worked at the Met. It was December 14th, 1981.
Oh.
Because I had worked for Zeffirelli in Italy. And when I came home to the Met and he heard I was there, I started working on that show. And originally we had Jose Carreras and Teresa Stratas as Musetta, as a Mimi and Rodolfo. And Renata Scotto, playing against type, was the Musetta. Now, the reason I ask is the dress that you wore was the dress that Scotto wore. The costume, the stage direction, the everything was built on the original, which by then was only about 2 years old. Now it's a 40-plus-year-old production.
Oh, yeah.
It was still very new.
Yeah.
And it was the hottest production at the Met. And Scotto was still around. I don't know if you met her and spoke to her.
There's a story about her later, I'll tell you.
Well, okay. Because, Malfitano, then very young artist, Shikoff, young artist, and all of you were very young in their roles. And I mention that because eventually, as Mirella Freni said to me, I could be Mimi's grandmother by now. And
you know that she was supposed to sing the Mimi? Do you know that I can't remember, that was the time where she came in from Japan and was on a flight where the air conditioning apparently ruined her voce. Whatever. That was a spring in for Catherine Malfitano.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. It was a wonderful chance for her, and she made a deal of it. And the entire experience for me was just transcendent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So talk about Scotto and anything you want to say about her.
Wonderful. Big fan. Good grief. When I was learning Madame Butterfly, I listened to everything she did. Everything. I mean, I was just listening to her recording of Cho-Cho San, and I just loved the colors of her voice. And I never really met her under any circumstances until the last Met tour that I was singing La Traviata on, and we were in Atlanta. It was a big night. Nello Santi was conducting all of those performances, and he wouldn't let me sing a high E flat, but that's all right. Everything else cooked. And after the performance was over, and it was a big success, I must say, I was thrilled to be able to sing it on tour with the Met. This petite woman comes from the side of the stage with a bouquet of flowers in her hand and gave them to me. Karina.
No.
I just couldn't believe it. I was in New York in 2014 for a gala there. We were in Hotel Pierre or somewhere. And she came up to me and she said, "Do you remember who I am?" I said, "Do I remember who you are? Do you remember who I am?" And she said, "Karina." I mean, little things like that can make all of those years, regardless of the good, the bad, and the ugly, you just remember there are great personalities, great people. And she was really, and great singers. She was all of that.
So you prompt a story I didn't expect to tell, but my job at the Met required that I be at the Met all the time. Whatever was coming in, I had to be there. So I never went out on tour with the company. But in 1986, which was the last year of the tour,
That was it. Yeah.
I said to then general manager Bruce Crawford that, if necessary, I'll take it as a vacation week, but I have to experience the Met tour. And he very kindly said, "Well, we'll pay you and you'll go out on tour and you'll learn and you can talk about it." And here I am now, many years later. And he said, "Go to Atlanta." He said, "Because you're going to find that Atlanta is the most hospitable of the cities on the Met tour. You're made very welcome. There are parties and the audiences are great. And now Atlanta Opera is a wonderful opera company, one of the best. But at that time it wasn't. And therefore, it was a big deal every May or early June to have the Met come to Atlanta." And so I saw that performance of yours of Madame Butterfly, because I went to all the performances during the week. And would you talk about just the sensation, for people who don't know, the Metropolitan Opera from about 1884 to 1986 toured every year. And it would go around the United States and occasionally abroad. And in the early years, way before you and I, they would go by train to San Francisco, to Nebraska, wherever they went. And by your time, artists would fly in and out.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'd stay the whole week. Sometimes they go on to the next city. But it was kind of like an opera people's holiday. And I was very happy to be part of that. There was a sadness about it being the last tour. But on the other hand, there was an awareness that bringing opera to the people, so to speak. And you grew up, I believe, near Cincinnati. Is that correct?
They always got that wrong. And on my Met debut, that wonderful man, what was his name, who did the moderations of the broadcasts?
Either Milton Cross or Peter Allen.
It was the gala where I was allowed to sing with Italo Taio, the Don Pasquale duet.
Right.
That's another story.
We're going to talk about October 22nd, 1983. I was the manager. That was my favorite night at the Met.
You know what? I almost didn't get to sing that with Italo Taio. I was supposed to sing La Ci Darem la Mano with John Cheek. Nothing against John, but I didn't know that duet. I'd never sung Marcellina and what's her name?
Zerlina.
That's her. I knew it was Alina. And because I never sang her, I couldn't remember her name. I was not pleased. And John Pritchard was to conduct. And my teacher was saying, "You don't need to sing this at the Met. This is not your fach. This is not who you are vocally." And I said, "Well, and you're going to tell Jimmy Levine that's not who I am?" Italo did. Italo said, "Barbara, I am her teacher in Cincinnati, and I have to have her. I have to have Norina." And I had sung Norina for the first and last time in my life at the Kennedy Center. George London got me that job. I sang her. I loved her. She was cute. Nobody ever asked me to sing her again, except at that Met Gala with Italo. Is that a riot?
Yeah.
That is, I have the recording of that. However, when all of the entrances and exits were played on PBS or whatever, that was left out. I don't know why, but I have it. And if I loved Italo, and we loved performing together, many butterfly and many La Bohemes together, and this one wonderful duet, Don Pasquale. If you ever want to see it, and I've never seen it, it's a riot. It is a riot.
Um, Italo Tayo, let's talk about the reason I asked about Cincinnati was because if you are from in or near Cincinnati, it's a
Granville, not Greenville, Granville, Denison
Granville.
University. Yeah.
Okay, the reason is because Cincinnati, like New York, has a very long opera tradition.
Oh, yeah.
Therefore, the people in that part of the United States always live with opera in a way that they didn't in Atlanta and they didn't in a lot of places.
Mm.
But since you raised it, let's go right to the Met Gala, which was of all the nights that I worked at the Met, that was my favorite night of the day and night. It was October 22nd, 1983, and it was the 100th birthday of the Met. The Met had opened October 22nd of 1883 with the opera Faust by Gounod, and they did Faust so often in the early years of the Met that the Met was known as the Faustspiel House because they played it constantly. And even now, when you go to the Met Annals, Faust is very high in terms of number of performances
Yeah.
because it was so done so often in the early years. We have to remember, in 1883, Puccini was not yet composing, so there were no Bohemes and there were no Manon Lescauts and Butterflies and Toscas to do as they later would. The Verdis were mostly Traviata, Rigoletto. They were not doing the Simone Boccanegra's, the Nabuccos, and so on. Those came much later. And therefore, the repertoire was more French, Germanic, with some Italian. They did a lot of Lucia di Lammermoor in the early years, often in German at the Met.
Mm.
But 100 years later, the Metropolitan Opera had become, if not the greatest, it was my view it was, but one of the certainly greatest opera houses and companies in the world, and the chorus and all the great artists who were there. So anyone who was asked to sing that night, and I remind listeners, that was your debut year. You were a very young artist at the Met.
Mm-hmm.
And Birgit Nielsen sang that night. I mean, we're talking about all the titans of opera.
Yep.
The only ones who were not there were Leonie Rieseneck, John Vickers, Tatiana Troyanos, and Renata Scotto were basically the only ones. Opera houses all over the world shut because all the great singers were in New York. And so I remember the dressing room situation that day, that we basically had to pair everybody up, and everybody was very cooperative. But, by the end of something like 15 hours, the conclusion were Luciano Pavarotti and Leontine Price together, Ballo and Moscata. They had never sung together at the Met and never would. And after that, Birgit Nielsen was the surprise conclusion. What memories do you have of that day, which was it was like being in an opera hall of fame. Alfredo Kraus in the afternoon, Montreux Caballé earlier in the morning than she ever sang in her life, Joan Sutherland, Marilyn Horne at night. Every single person you would want was there. Domingo Pavarotti, Domingo with Franey. It was just stunning. Catherine Malfitano and Alfredo Kraus. The pairings were remarkable.
Yes.
So talk about that day from your perspective as a very young artist, your first year at the Met, and seeing these legends.
As I say, it's so long ago. I have to sort of shut my eyes and remember where I was from the point of taking off my own clothes, putting on my own dress. I had my own dress, which I had dragged from Castle, but got a lot of compliments on it. Mm-hmm. It was a very nice dress. It had only cost $200. I mean, some of the ladies on that stage were wearing $2,000 dresses. Yeah. What do I care? I had my makeup done by a good friend, a famous makeup artist, Charles Elson. who had worked at the Cincinnati Opera for years and years and years. And he said, I will do your makeup for this television. And I was so nervous. And he came and he did the makeup and he put on false eyelashes that I couldn't open my eyes with. So shortly before my entrance, I ripped both of the eyelashes off. And by God, did Charles call and tell me, I saw you, you ripped off the eyelashes. And I said, listen, I was in such a state of what? Euphoria. Yeah, I couldn't believe it myself. There were too many people around me that I had spent hours and hours listening to on record. Then you didn't have the Met over television. I had never been to the Met except to audition way back when I first became a soprano, and that was short and sweet. Didn't win anything, got their attention though. But it was there suddenly backstage with all of these dinosaurs. I mean, I felt humbled, very humbled. It was fun.
I do want to define a little bit dinosaur for people who may take that wrong. What we did in the something like the 15th or 16th hour, we had all of these retired legendary artists. We had to place them on the stage, and there was even a bit of politics about who sat where. And Zinka Milanov, the great soprano, insisted on being in the front row, just a little left of center. We had Yarmila Novotna. We had everyone alive who was not singing, but was a great artist who sang at the Met. So therefore, you had people who had sung at the Met in 1922 seated on that stage, and they were ancient. And we had Risa Stevens sitting right next to Zinka Milanov, and Risa was a lovely, kind person, and Zinka was lovely in her way, but she was formidable. And she did not like being seated next to Risa Stevens because Risa is what in German is called a Publikumsliebling. She was much loved by the public. And Zinka was revered as a singer, but she was not warm and cuddly. And at the moment when we raised the curtain and there were the dinosaurs, let's call them, the crowd leapt to its feet because they'd been sitting for hours anyway, cheering. And then the stage manager gave the indication everyone is to please sit down. And Zinka very conveniently didn't see that. So Risa sort of indicated everyone around her, let's sit down now. And they sat down, and Zinka remained standing. And the crowd kept cheering as if she was taking her solo bow. Marilyn Horne was then the first artist to come out and sing. And she came out on the stage and went right over to Risa, walked past Zinka Milanov, and gave her a big hug, and then turned and sang to the audience. If I ever find my video of the whole thing from that night, and I have 25 hours to watch it, I think I'll be able to write a book just about that night. It was just, if ever I thought, gee, maybe opera's too tough to work in, that was the night that confirmed to me, no. All of you people, the dinosaurs, even the 2 or 3 difficult ones, and there are not many difficult opera singers, as you know. There are a couple. You have to really work well together or you can't do opera. It was just so wonderful. And I got to hear just about everyone that, I'd heard many, but to hear them all in one night was kind of like caviar on top of chocolate truffles on top of champagne. And it was just everything together. And it's strange how 43 years later, I still remember moments from that night. What Alfredo Kraus wore, the way he kissed Catherine Malfitano's hand, the way Joan Sutherland just stood and received the applause, but didn't do a Zinka Milanov kind of thing, and then let out this amazing sound singing Semiramide, which is something I never got to hear her sing live. One of the great things that night was that James Levine and Charlie Rieker and other people who did the programming often had people sing things we didn't get to hear them do. So it was not like, let's have, I don't know, we for the first time that night heard Eva Martone sing Turandot. We had never heard it before. So that was that kind of event. We heard Kiri Takano was sing the Countess in Le Nozze di Figaro, something we had heard before. She was beautiful, of course, but it was not quite the same sensation as hearing someone do something we didn't know. And so I wish that they would release the entire broadcast and not just the highlights, because opera lovers now need to watch and need to know and need to see and understand even the deportment of opera singers and how people behaved. And I don't mean in a quote diva or prima donna way, but in terms of collegiality. The wonderful Loretta DeFranco, who was a beloved member of the company for decades, was not necessarily a star, but was a loved member. And they gave her a prominent place in the final curtain call because she was loved as a member of the company. And it spoke to all of that.
Mm.
And they used to call it the Met Family. And in fact, the website was metfamily.org. And I'm not saying it's not familial now, but it's just different. It was a different environment then because the opera world was different then. You, as someone who was a very young artist then, had a very long career and now teach and are still connected to opera, what changes do you see in terms of not so much the opera world and its management, but the way young singers approach their roles?
Oh, it started to change before I was ready to sort of say, it's been a great ride. Let's leave before they start writing critiques that let them know that they realize you're no longer a young artist and they can compare one performance to another and say, is she still out there? I had followed some of these developments while I was at the Met. I didn't ever want to be somebody that hung around too long. But I also was seeing young careers sort of start and end very quickly. In other words, in Europe, it was always the joke. I mean, next to toilet paper, the quickest thing that could be used up would be a young opera voice. I mean, they were, after the Iron Curtain fell especially, there were just lines and lines and lines of fabulous voices. Cheap, it just happened. And I guess you can't blame anybody for it. If there are enough people to sort of use, you just don't stay true and make a family and build an ensemble that stays together for years and years and years. I remember one of the great influences in my life at the Met was Charlie Anthony. I mean, I think Charlie Anthony grew up at the Met as a child. I mean, he was just there the whole time, like Loretta DeFranco and many, many others. And to be part of a family like that, it was like that in Europe when I came. It was not like that when I left. Mm-hmm. Contracts were not being signed for 3 to 4 years in advance. You were lucky, and it started even at a place like Milan La Scala, that they would throw up an entire program. In 2 weeks, they'd just throw it overboard, and everybody went with it. You know that. Yep. Everything changed, and it became rather depressing. Mm-hmm. Depressing. And so I decided to sort of pull my own plug around 50. I figured this is a good time to do it. My daughter's 15. My husband's put up with all of this for a long time. Mm-hmm. And it was changing enough for me to realize to go out and sing the repertoire that I loved. And a lot of them were like Cho-Cho-San. You begin to realize as a 45-year-old woman that you can only play Cho-Cho-San to a certain audience with maybe 3,000 seats and good makeup and a great wig. I got it done. I got it done late. It went well. And then I said, that's it. Cho-Cho, it's been a great ride. All of these young, dying women that I loved them all. Manon Lescaut, Cho-Cho-San, Violetta. My mother once asked me, she said, you ever see anything funny?
Linda.
Yeah, well, yeah. And then you show up in Vienna, which was also a fantastic debut for me as Rosalinda, next to unbelievable stars. I mean, Bernd and all the big Vienna gang. And I just loved to sing that there. And then 20 years later, Bo Scofus showed up as Eisenstein. And I thought, Christ, he's my son. I can't do this anymore. And things were changing because the camera was right up your nose hole. It
Yep.
was no longer that long distance fantasy world that I grew up in Cincinnati. That's a huge house. For me, coming from Cincinnati to the Met was not a shock. It was,
Right.
wow. And it's even got red and gold everywhere. It was a different atmosphere because you were put under a different microscope.
Yeah.
That's okay. All is fair in love and war and television. But I thought maybe, okay, we're not going to go into buffo alto roles, although I was asked to do a couple. And some of the last pieces I did, I thought I could get away with. I mean, Barbara Stanwyck was not a child when she played all of these Western heroes. So I got in a few fanciullas and I got in some good Toscas.
We're going
And
to get to fanciulla because it's an important chapter, but let's stick where we are because I do want to talk to you about fanciulla.
Paso.
Yeah. Um, but I want to point out something else to listeners who, may be meeting Barbara Daniels for the first time, that you and Placido Domingo were among the few people to sing successive opening nights. I think Martina Arroyo did it in the 70s, but to be asked to sing the opening night of the Metropolitan Opera is a big deal. And Domingo did more than anyone else by a long shot. And I should parenthetically say who was Charles Anthony. His name was Charles Anthony Caruso, and he was from New Orleans, and he was a character tenor, and he came to New York and auditioned for Rudolph Bing, who was then general manager of the Met in the early 1950s. And Mr. Bing said, well, you're hired, but we're changing your name because we can't have a second Caruso. So he was made Charles Anthony. And Charles Anthony, if you go into the Met archives, sang more performances at the Met than anyone else in the history of the company, and was a beloved figure, Charlie Anthony. He was encouraging to generations and generations of young artists,
Yeah.
and was so loved. And he continued to sing well into old age. And almost, unfortunately, as soon as he stopped singing, he died. He didn't have an illness per se, but his life was so tied up with singing opera at the Met that, I'm not a doctor, so I can't say that that's what did him in. But it must have been that after 55 years of love that he had and gave, that suddenly to be alone must have been very hard for him.
Yep.
Because he wasn't particularly old. He began when he was quite young, and he probably was around 80, and very fit, but then just died. But at the end, he would sing the Emperor al Tum and Turandot and things like that.
Yeah.
Non perderti straniero. And
Yeah.
everybody would cheer to hear Charles Anthony at the end. But anyway, you sang in opening nights in the 1990 season and again in the 1991 season. And in 1990, you were Musetta with Morella Fredi, Placido Domingo, Christian Badia conducting. In 91, it was a very special night. And I mention this because when the Met was looking for great artists to do big nights, you were one of the people they went to. And you were. And because you were a modest, sweet young woman from the Midwest, it's, in my view, my knowing you, it never went to your head. And and you were always beautifully prepared and gave great performances and so on. But that 1991 opening night was important because it was the 25th anniversary of the opening of the new Metropolitan Opera House at Lincoln Center, and therefore a very big deal. And they did 3 acts. They did Act 3 of Rigoletto with Leo Nucci, Cheryl Studer, and Luciano Pavarotti, and Nikolai Ghiaurov. They did Act 3 of Otello with Placido Domingo and Varela Freni and Justino Diaz. And then they did Act 2 of Die Fledermaus with you and Rosalinda. And then had all these people show up to, sing guest arias as happens in Fledermaus. But, that's rare company. Were you aware of it at the time, or were you, I don't want to say just doing your job, but were you doing your job?
I was very busy. I mean, those fanciulla rehearsals were
Well,
They
Fanciulla came a little bit. We're going to get to Fanciulla, but I want to just talk about these opening
know
nights.
that the fanciulla and the Rosalinda did not belong in the same Barbara Daniels body. And
Right. Okay.
rather shocked. I was rather shocked that they wanted me to mix the two of them up because it was getting close to premiere time for the mini, and Rosalind is a whole other ball of wax here, and the voice was through the Puccini was already going in a more mature direction, and the Rosalinda has got to be light. It's got to be champagne-y. It's got to have that sparkle. And boy, I can tell you a story now, and he's passed on, so he won't be offended. Jimmy was going to conduct it, and we had the first rehearsal down underneath the Met, one of the big
Scratchy. Who was conducting?
Jimmy, the
Bob,
the Fledermaus, and Herman Pride was singing. And it was studded, you know, all the big stars were in it singing their parts. And I was going to do the Rosalinda. Old friend had done it before. They knew that. Okay, but to pull her out of the hat. And then he took a tempo that I thought, he's going to meet me from behind before I ever get off the starting block here. I mean, it was just really fast, really fast. And Placido was listening to that rehearsal when we went onto the stage and rehearsed it with him. And he said, and now he's even farther away from you. He said, it's not like you're schlepping. He said, it's not that, but I would talk to him. And I said, oh, you would you? And I would go into Jimmy and say, hey, Jimmy, could you slow it down a little? Guess what? Placido sort of gave me the courage to go in, knock on his door, and ask him if he could possibly just pull it back a little bit. And he did. And it was fun. We had a great time. And then I think it was, a week later? I'm not sure exactly what the dates were, but Minnie was on the blocks. She was out there. And that's just a whole other voice.
Let's get into La Fanciulla del West, because it was an opera that Puccini wrote for the Metropolitan Opera. It premiered in, I should just know this by heart, December of 1910, I believe, but was not done very often because it's a very particular voice. Renato Tebaldi did it for quite a while. Leontine Price tried it, but it didn't quite work. I think Dorothy Kirsten sang it a bit, but very few people did it. After you, Deborah Voigt did it, but it's a role that I'm going to ask you to talk about what makes it complicated, but it's my second favorite Puccini opera after Suor Angelica. I love the score. The story, yes, is a bit silly, but it's actually very beautiful because it's about love and faith. And no one dies, which is unusual for a Puccini opera. And it's about loneliness. It captures all kinds of emotions that he did not tackle in his other operas. And by then he was a more mature composer, having done Manon Lescaut and then Bohème and then Tosca and then Butterfly. He grew in his artistry with every opera. And I think that this was the place where he merged his sophistication with his ability to go right to the core of a character, with fantastic music that was very dramatic. I mean, Tosca is great, but Tosca is familiar. Somehow, Minnie is her name in La Fanciulla del West, the girl of the Golden West, we sometimes call it, is very particular. She is very American. I don't believe you have to be an American to play her, but American women who do play her, like you and Deborah Voigt and Dorothy Kirsten, brought something more just by your Americanness. The conductor was Leonard Slatkin, making his debut. The production, very beautiful, I think, but large as a set, was Giancarlo Del Monaco, and the designer was Michael Scott. And it was a very large set. So talk first about the fact that I remember I was no longer working there full time, but I was there and I was at some of the rehearsals, walking on that set and thinking, this is going to be hard to sing in. So talk about all that, because it was right after you did opening night of Fledermaus. You went right into
Yep.
preparation for the new production on October 10th. It opened 1991
Yep.
of a rarely seen Puccini opera, La Fanciulla del West.
What can I tell you except that you get a couple of big presents, maybe at the beginning of your career, maybe at the end. I was always getting these nice presents, and many of them came from the Met, other places also. But I think, and I have to go back to the telephone call from Jonathan Friend when he said, "We have been thinking, we would like to offer you the role of Minnie in the new production of Fanciulla del West." I mean, I had to sit down. I really had to sit down.
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Can I get back to you? I have to ask the people who prepare me for these roles, and I will let you know." But I'm honored. It was done in 48 hours. It was done, and I had heard that there had been some other considerations. I can't even remember at this point who they might have been, but I was just thrilled. I was thrilled, and it stayed that way. It was a high that started at the very first rehearsal. Although Giancarlo, I have to go back a little bit here. He took over the intendance of the Castle Staatstheater as I left, and he tried to convince me to stay there. He said, "You'll be under my wing. We'll do great things. Why are you leaving Castle? The world isn't ready for you yet. And I said, ciao, and I went to Köln. Now he's going to be the director of this piece. And of course, true to Giancarlo, big mouth, and right off the cuff, he comes in and he said, "Well, I can't really say that you're a fanciulla, you're a little old for that, but from far away, it may work." And so the game was on. I certainly wasn't the oldest person on the stage. There were older people, but they fit in their roles. And because all the men were older than I was, I certainly, day for day, began to feel, I don't want to say younger, but it was easier to play with them. Cheryl, for instance, I mean, that was a tennis game. That man, Placido, I mean, they were just all great. And for me, there was never, when I say work, there was never any sweat. We either sang out or we didn't sing out. When I sang out, Slatkin knew what I was doing. I was working a role into my body that everybody else already had, except maybe some of the minors with beautiful roles that they got to sing, you know. But Placido knew his role very well. Cheryl had sung his for years. I was out there trying to work it in because I knew that it was not going to be easy. Michael Scott had showed me, I knew Michael Scott from the Castle Opera, and he said, "Listen, I have tried to do my best to make sure that the sound on that stage will, being the raked stage in wood, is going to throw the voice out the way we tried to do it in the badly built German theaters." It helped. It helped. I'm not certain that it solved all the problems. The bar was contained. The cabin was contained. The third act was a bitch. The third act, riding, he wanted me to ride out on the horse and jump off. That didn't work because the double fell off her horse at the first rehearsal, so that was canceled. We just heard Minnie screaming off stage, and then I ran on up the stage. I mean, this was fitness studio at its best and worst. I was never in better shape, and I don't want to say I never had more fun, but man, it was fun. It really was. And it stayed fun. It remained fun. And I was very grateful to the Met and all the people involved with that gave me one of the great gifts of my singer life.
One of the great Puccini acts, I believe, is Act Two of this opera. He did a lot of great acts too in his operas, in Tosca being another, Bohème. There are a lot of good acts too. Butterfly, it's hard to describe what is Act Two and Act Three, but in the Il Trittico, the second act is Suor Angelica, so really wonderful. But this particular opera, Turandot Act Two, is remarkable.
Yeah.
But this particular one is notable because there are not many characters on the stage. It's a snowstorm, and it's a card game. And not much happens except that everything happens. And I never worked with Giancarlo Del Monaco, so I can't give any opinion. But I felt that the direction, even though you were very upstage, of the card game where you and Jack Rance play for the life of Placido Domingo, of your tenor Dick Johnson, um, and you pull a card out of your stocking and tre assi un paio, perfectly staged. Would you, from I can tell you from an audience member's point of view, at least my point of view, it was a perfectly staged, difficult moment that was as good as it gets. And I remember everything about your performance and Cheryl Milnes because it was just intense in a good way. Was that your perspective?
I'll tell you, first of all, in listening to the opera myself, and I had seen it on film, on television, at the time when Placido did his first Dick Johnson with Carol Neblett. So, I mean, I was a fan of hers. We met under strange circumstances, but she was hot, and the two of them were very hot, and it was also an extremely.
You mean sexy?
Well, yeah, and I mean, she had a hell of a voice, and I thought, good God, here we are again, not Susanna the Countess, but I'm going to listen to what she does with this piece, and see if it appeals to me. And one thing my teacher said to me, she said, listen, this is another thing a little like Manon Lescaut. You have a couple of nice moments in Manon Lescaut, but the arias go to the tenor. And this is even worse. You're going to have a lot of dialogue, and you're going to get a couple of sort of arietas, but you're not going to get the big aria with the, like Umbildi. I said, I don't care. I want to make it work. And the second act scared the shit out of me. Mm-hmm. I played cards for 2 weeks with Jim DeBlaise at his apartment, trying to figure out how you keep up with. The great help was Leonard Slatkin. Slatkin said, I'm not going to slow it down. I'm going to keep my tempo, but I will not race on. I don't care where the bar line is until you've got those cards where they belong. We worked that out. And a greater partner to play poker with, and I don't know how to play poker, is Cheryl Milnes. He was nervous. He was sweating bullets. I was sweating bullets. At one point, some creme, there was a cake on my cake that I baked. There was that all over the table. It was on the cards. I mean, I thought, this is really awful. But guess what? It ratcheted up the energy. It made us more nervous and made us look like we were sweating really, and we were really sweating. I think that Giancarlo was a genius. He was nuts. Nuts. Hi, Giancarlo. But I don't think that I could have had a better director for that piece, or a better conductor, and the partners, that goes without saying. I mean, it was matched up. Somebody said it was charismatic. We didn't talk about any of that stuff, and there was no playing around. Somebody asked me once, didn't Placido ask to kiss you backstage or something like that? I said, no. And I said, if he had, and he wouldn't have, it would have ruined that symbiosis. And that's the way it stayed for every performance, and the filming then, which was difficult the next year. Grateful, happy and grateful.
I should say that back in that era, when we filmed productions, a lot of them were broadcast live to Europe because they were afternoons in New York and later seen on American television.
Yeah.
And sometimes, quote, corrections were made, not musical corrections, but let's say that a camera was moving across the stage, we would correct that, because at that time, they didn't have the sophisticated digital technology of now. We had big cameras. And one of my many jobs there was that when we had the broadcast, I had to move people from their subscription seats to other seats so that we could install these huge stationary cameras, nothing moving around like now, which is terrific. But everything had to be in place and filmed, and you could hear the whirring sound of the camera as it recorded. And we're talking 30-ish years ago, 33 years ago, but all the technology has changed completely. And it was much harder in a way back then to do these broadcasts, these telecasts. But that was the very first telecast that Met did was March 1977, was Bohème with Scotto as Mimi and Luciano as Rodolfo. And that looks practically like from, the Stone Age in terms of technology. And with every production we did by the early 80s, we did a Don Carlo in 1983 and a Simone Boccanegra. And they're very good technologically, but with each one, they got better. So by 1991, technologically, they were better. But were you aware of the cameras? No. Okay.
And not only that, one of the assistants told me after the first day, he said, "Oh, you got to go back to the trailer. You got to go back and look. Placid was back there all the time checking himself out. Go back and take a look." And I said, "Nope." I said, "I don't want to see it." I said, "If they've got it in the can, it's in the can. If it's going well, it's going well. And if not, somebody will fix it." But I mean, there was no fixing. They just, as far as I could tell, they just turn on the cameras and let them run. And I never saw one mic, never saw one camera, nothing. Nothing. And I wasn't looking for them either. I think the great thing about John Carlos production is when you were up there, you were in it. You were in that cabin. I felt I lived in that cabin, really. The only horror was getting that damn dress off and getting something else on. I mean, the first costume and the second back there right behind that door. I mean, that was always a question mark. Are we going to make it? Are we not going to make it? We always made it. And then one time, Cheryl was being his grabby, rapey self and pulled me back to him. That was before I run to the bed and grabbed the gun. All of my hair, which was open, got wrapped around his badge. I think he pulled out 2 handfuls. It didn't matter. We just kept. And one time my hair caught on fire with the candle. That would have been life. That would have been real. For me, it was realism, opera at its best. It didn't get any better for me. I mean, it really didn't.
It was remarkable. I'm glad it was preserved on film. For listeners who don't know, I want to explain something you just said. The Met stage goes from west to east, and the auditorium, the 3,786 people, are in the eastern part of the building. And before that is very eastern. That's the front of house where people would enter to go to the auditorium. But then you have the orchestra pit, and then you have the stage. And the main stage is 60 feet by 60 feet, 28 meters-ish square. And there are platforms on the side of equal size where scenery can be rolled on. And then there's a rear stage, which for Bohème, they would bring in Act 2 from that direction on a rolling platform. But behind that is the loading dock. And to the left, if you have your back to the loading dock, are the dressing rooms, and the artists would come that way. But the loading dock would then lead out to Amsterdam Avenue. And that's where scenery and everything was brought in. But that was also where the truck was when we did broadcasting. And it's still there, in fact, when they do broadcasting. And Amsterdam Avenue at that point really, really slopes. And the reason that was an issue for me as the manager was that in bad weather like rain or snow, we would have slush, and we'd have to always clean up around the truck to prevent transmission problems. And I remember very vividly, it was Cheryl Milnes in Simone Boccanegra with Anna Tomova Sintova's Amelia. And we were doing a live broadcast to Europe, and it was the winter. And south of the loading dock would be the Big Apple Circus. And at that time, the Big Apple Circus had elephants.
Oh.
And they would take the elephants out for their toileting before the performance of the circus. We were doing Simone Boccanegra, and I got a call that there was a problem with the truck in terms of the snow. And I went wearing a tuxedo back out onto Amsterdam Avenue, and suddenly the snow melted by this yellow river from the elephants who were eliminating themselves. And standing up on the loading dock was a wonderful guy. You probably knew him, maybe not by name, named Dennis Kronyak, who was a veteran guy in the stage crew with a very salty mouth. And I was standing there covered in elephant urine and snow in my tuxedo. And he said to me, "Well, you did want to be in show business, didn't you?" And I'm telling the story because people in the public would not and should not know what was going on backstage that way. But when people talk about backstage life, they look for something naughty. It's typically not. It was more of that type of thing where we had to deal with problems all the time and make it happen for the audience in a way that the audience didn't know that, the truck was being shut down by elephant urine and snow. But you, that night, those performances of fanciulla, I went to all of them, really made that opera even more special for me than it was before. I liked it from recordings, and I had seen one performance in Italy. But that was a time where I just basically lived a production and learned an opera. And although I had known you and admired your artistry for years before, that was in a way the culmination of everything I wanted from an opera performance. And that's why I wanted to bring it up and touch on it in great detail. You then did, you sang Nedda in Pagliacci, which is a different kind of role in a way. But then you did, for your last production at the Met, the great Zeffirelli production of Falstaff, you were Alice Ford with Sir John Falstaff, Paul Pliszka, Ellen Horn as Dame Quickly, Barbara Bonney as Nannetta, a wonderful cast. And even down, I would say down to, because it was a small role, Michel Seneschal as Dr. Caius. Did you have interactions with him?
I can't really remember.
Yeah.
That was also Marilyn Horne was involved in that too, right?
Marilyn Horne was the Quickly,
and Jimmy.
Nothing, one of his favorite roles.
I remember Marilyn and I got along like a house of fire. We had done Falstaff before in Chicago together, and she said it's going to be a little bit different with Jimmy. He said you can act, you just be sure that he knows that he's got your eye on him. She said, you don't have to freeze and stare at him. She said, but the freedom that I loved being on stage in other productions where nobody really, because I took over some roles and I always had assistants, stage assistants who, I don't want to say they let me do anything I wanted. That's not the game. But I mean, in terms of being on the stage years in Europe, you know that there's an extra eyeball, either for the television monitor, right, left, or wherever the hell they are, or for the conductor who you always see. But there are some conductors who didn't grow up in that school. Charles Dutoit was one of those. He just unbelievable. Faust with him, with Neil Chikoff, also with Paco Francisco Araiza, Jimmy Morris, and Sam Raimi. But Dutoit just didn't, at one rehearsal, he said, could you all just stand still and watch me? And I thought, ooh, this is going to be fun. On that stage, do you remember the Faust stage? It was a turning circle. You make one wrong step and you're out of there. We even lost the carpet in the scene where my hair caught on fire in the church. I mean, and to keep your eyes on Dutoit, no, you were busy watching the television monitor and you just kept on singing. But I mean, Falstaff was one of those great, sort of the end run, basically, because I don't think they knew what to bring me back in. I remember Jimmy coming back. Fanciulla was not scheduled to be rescheduled. They didn't really talk about anything in the future. And I thought, well, look, you started at age 44, 45, going into a role that's another one of these girls, fanciulla. You've been at it for 10 years here at this place. Let's see what comes up. I had never really covered. I had had 8 performances and maybe was on cover for 1. but never had to go on. I was thankful for those years, and I thought, well, listen, if they don't have any good ideas, it's because, and I told you, the world was changing. The Iron Curtain came down, and there were lots of sopranos coming in that were, I don't want to say they were being paid for, but there were a lot of roles that were being taken over and considered for different types of operas that I had never sung, perhaps.
Mhm.
I don't know. And I thought Falstaff was just a great fun way to sort of end it with Pliska and Marilyn, and finally James Levine for the whole evening.
Right.
That was fun. That was
You
fun.
know, we're talking about conductors. The Met finally did Attila in recent years, Verdi's Attila.
Yeah.
Hard opera to do. It's a wonderful opera. I love all of Verdi, and it's a wonderful opera. And so I was called in a bit to do a couple of things with them. And I got to know Violetta Urmana, who is a wonderful, charismatic artist. No BS with Violetta Urmana. And Riccardo Muti, who had never conducted the Met, was brought in to conduct this, and that was a big deal too. And because great Verdi conductor. And I said to her one day, when Violetta, when you look at Maestro Muti, she said, I don't look at Maestro Muti. He looks at me.
There it is. There it is. There it is. Yeah. Probably the way it should be and always was, depending, there are the singers that still stand and just stare right at the conductor. Fewer.
There's someone else I want to ask you about. I don't know if you have any memories of him, but I have very strong memories of him. Americans know that one of our most famous comic actors was Sid Caesar. And Sid Caesar had a television show in the 50s, among the most famous. He had the best writers among them. Mel Brooks wrote for Sid Caesar
Yeah.
before he went on his own. Carl Reiner, Neil Simon, all wrote for Sid Caesar. He was a highly talented man and a very nervous man in his way. And he'd not done much live theater and certainly not live opera. And he was brought in to play Frush the jailer in Die Fledermaus.
Yes.
I spent a great deal of time with Sid Caesar, which was a thrill for me because he was a hero, but he was definitely very nervous.
Yes.
And his routines and how jokes would land in an opera, because for people who don't know, Frush is the drunken jailer in the third act who has a very long monologue that often is not set in stone, but relates to current events going on in the city or this nation where the opera is being done. And so we had previously had Otto Schenk, who had directed the production, and he did a very Austrian interpretation, a little too Austrian for me. So they brought in Sid Caesar. They also had a comic actor, Dom DeLuise, who was very funny. But Sid Caesar did his routines of different languages and sound effects and so on. And it was very funny, but he at a certain point had to interact with the other characters, especially the tenor, but also Rosalinda. Can you tell me anything about Sid Caesar from your experience?
Well, he was very nervous. I mean, he kept not knowing he had a microphone, right?
Yeah.
Remember that. And you had to be careful to not get too close to him while blasting out something, especially in the third act, where he interacts with Rosalinda Eisenstein and both the ladies from the ball, Ida and Adele, and the jailer. It was difficult, I think, for him to interact with us, and yet in being that drunk, he could keep his distance and make it believable. And he got the job done beautifully, I thought. I mean, he died 1,000 deaths every time at every rehearsal. And of course, we rehearsed without mics, and then at one point he did get his mic. And then I think he felt maybe less nervous. I don't know. What did you think?
Come sit in my office when you were not in rehearsals, because he didn't want to be seen out in the public in the opera house because he was Sid Caesar. He was more famous than any of you because he was one of the most famous television stars in the history of television.
A genius.
He was a real genius, and a friend of mine, David Margolick, is bringing out a biography soon about him. But he just had to sort of be locked away. and my office offered a refuge because he said, I know you're not going to ask me about, doing TV in the 50s, and you're just going to let me be, right? And I said, yes, of course, Sid. He let me call him Sid. And I obviously wanted to ask him all kinds of things, but I really didn't. And part of my job was for certain nervous artists, there were not that many, but there were a few, to offer refuge and comfort when any of the other people they were dealing with had expectations. Carlos Kleiber wanted to have dinner with me. Jose Carreras just wanted to feel comfortable and quiet in my presence. And so we did that. And I'm not saying anything out of school to say that, because he just wanted to be calm before performances. Other artists had particular needs, and I would take care of them in a way that was not conspicuous to the public. But Sid Caesar needed to just be calm and not be questioned and not talk through the role at all. So we didn't talk about the production in any way. But sometimes I would be in the wings and he would look over me and I would just nod to calm him down. And other times he would come after to my office again when I needed to go home. It would be 1 a.m, but he just had to decompress that way.
Yeah.
I'm saying nothing out of school to say that he had in the past a drinking problem. And therefore, I don't think he was using alcohol at the time. I don't think at all. But the tension and the nervousness was a lot for him to deal with. And yet, as you said, and I agree, on the stage, he was brilliant.
Oh, that's the magic.
Yeah, it was remarkable that this man could walk into the Metropolitan Opera House in it was a very beautiful production. Gunther Schneider Siemsen designed it. It was very gorgeous and very Viennese and lots of choreography, and make it his own without stealing from the other artists.
Also, I can only remember that it was fun being across from him when he was doing his shtick. And it was Sid's shtick. And I thought that he, in this tradition of bringing more social themes into, depending on the city you're playing in, the country you're playing in, yes, Schenk was very Austrian. The production was my second production, and that was the one that I sang the most over here. So it was nothing new for me in New York. I knew that. But you're right, very Austrian. And yet, I think that Sid sort of felt at home on the set. Once his feet hit the stage, Sid was home.
Yeah.
It worked for him. I'm glad.
It was remarkable because off stage, he was just a different person. I've worked with many artists who I'll name one, Patricia Racette, can step off the stage and she's serene, and then step on the stage and be magnificent, and then step off and be serene again. And which is lovely, lovely. And, she's a great, great artist. But then there are others who need a lot of help, and that's okay. To just sort of separate from what they've just done.
There are stories. We all know them about the people that we know them about.
Yeah.
That they need a great deal of propping up behind the scenes. Either the wife or the husband or the teacher. I don't know. I didn't know too many of them really personally. Heard all the stories about Franco Corelli, all of them. It doesn't matter. If you sang like Franco, you could do anything behind the scenes you want. Yeah. But it's tough for people who are behind the scenes that don't know what to do to help you, right. Especially if you're ranting and raving. If you're having a bad night and you realize that this partner is having a bad night and he is taking it out on the people behind the scenes, that's happened. Not good.
There's also the thing that many artists come to this theater and don't want to bring the outside world. They want to leave the outside world behind them. Beverly Sills famously had all kinds of tribulations in her life and 2 children with illnesses and all kinds of things. And when she would come to the stage, she would feel joyous because it was a way to separate from that. Yeah. I'm going to talk about someone, this is not gossip, but it's a fact. It was Gana Dimitrova, the wonderful Bulgarian soprano, who came to the Met to do a series of Toscas, and I knew that something was not quite right. And we spoke Italian, and I asked her. I said, my question was always, "What can I do for you?" And she explained to me that her husband was very ill, but she didn't want to talk about it
I
and
remember that.
didn't want to tell the Met because she didn't want colleagues to worry, but she just wanted me to know. And so I was very present for her for those performances. They were wonderful. And then the husband sadly died, and she came back to do another run of Toscas, and they were much deeper. And I said to her, your Tosca's now rather remarkable. She said, because when I see Mario die in the third act, I see my husband. And I mention this only because what singers and actors and other performers on stages bring to their performances are not necessarily known by the public and should not be known by the public. But nonetheless, they deepen their portrayals, or their portrayals change based on their own life experience. And so, part of my job and my pleasure was to help people do that. I can tell you that I never had anything much to do with you because you were a very secure artist. You and Catherine Alfantano were two artists who I knew you were fine all the time. And which was a lovely thing from my managerial point of view. But, I'm not saying that I preferred artists who I had to help, but nonetheless, it was always wonderful to see you go on with such assurance and professionalism. And that became part of my admiration for you because it worked on the stage. That's all I can say on that topic. And I was talking about Beverly Sills. Beverly Sills, like you, chose to walk away from the career around 50. But as she said to me, and not just me, to many people, it became her standard line. She said, I decided to stop and smell the roses, but then I discovered I was allergic to roses. So, and she went on to a managerial career and all kinds of things that she did. But you, from what I know, obviously you're an American, but you've lived in Europe. You have a family in Europe and a life there, and you do teach. But
not anymore. Not anymore.
Not anymore. Okay.
I'm totally retired from everything except my husband and my family.
Well, that's good too.
I taught for 15 years, and I never thought I'd teach anybody anything, and I'm grateful for all of that.
Yeah. You still go to the opera?
Whew. Innsbruck was very lucky to have, after my intendant left, Fassbender.
Yeah.
I performed many Fledermauses together with her in Vienna. She came here and was the intendant for, I think, 2 or 3 sessions, longer time, and did a great job in that theater. Innsbruck is a very, very good theater. Doesn't do everything perfect, but I remember the orchestra being gangbusters, and it still is. Then they got someone else. He did okay. He followed her, and he did okay. Wasn't quite the same thing, but now they've got someone, which has happened in Europe often. It happens maybe worldwide. Someone with maybe not the chops. They don't really know what opera is from the inside to the out. They want to change everything because, first of all, they don't understand, and where they understand and they realize they're never going to make it on that level, they've got to get their name in the paper. It's like the whole thing that I put up with in Europe from the very beginning, actually, when they said the best thing is a bad review and people booing. Otherwise, you're not going to make the front page. And I thought, well, what a strange, it just didn't work. So I'm a stranger to the opera more often. I go to the symphony sometimes with my husband because he played in that orchestra for years and years. I don't really know, but a couple of people still in the Innsbruck Theater, both Americans, who've been there for a long time. But other than that, they've shook it up. They've shaken it up to the point where you don't know what you're seeing. It's got to be changed. It can't be in any way the way it was. I've taken part in modern versions of this, that, and the other. Sometimes they work. Carmen with motorcycles and this is the old hat now. As the erste junge Jungfrau in Moses and Aaron by Schoenberg in Cologne, my very first opera. Yep. Dressed in chrome yellow, a chrome yellow wig, chrome yellow hair, the whole costume, everything. 4 of us standing there, and the director says at the first rehearsal, he said, now you're going to take off your clothes, and your throats will be slit with prepared knives. And I said, guess what? I'm no prude. I don't have a bad body, but not with me. Within the week, they had 4 16-year-old girls who were more than glad to take off all their clothes for what they were being paid. It looked very, very, very realistic, and at least half of the audience stood up and left. They were in the news, top dollar, but we're going back to the 80s, the early 80s. And from then on, you have the feeling they're trying to kill opera over here. Kill it. I mean, kill it dead. They've been talking about it for years. I think Germany's in the worst problems. It's having the worst problems it's ever had. But there are still the shining examples from time to time that slip through. And if you've got a good public, they'll pull them in. The word will spread and they'll go. As soon as I not read a review, but I hear from people that I trust, they've got something there you've got to see. I'll be back in Innsbruck, or maybe Munich or whatever. Sometimes I'm in Kassel, where my own daughter plays in the orchestra from time to time, and my daughter-in-law plays French horn, first and third, and they do good performances. Mm-hmm. But not all of them are good. And opera is subsidized in a different way than in the United States, always has been. But if they kill it once, it's down. It's been a fight in the United States as well, has it not?
Sure.
Yep.
But one difference is I love one of the lines in Fledermaus. It comes up every so often. But I'm an Austrian civil servant. And and many of the people who work in the opera companies in Austria are civil servants. And the whole relationship, the economic relationship, but also the spiritual relationship to these companies is very different from what we have in the U.S.
Yes, but guess what? That's still a joke. In terms of civil and social and Beamten, that's a joke. It's still a joke.
I know. Yeah. Barbara, did I leave anything out that you wanted to cover?
No.
This has really been a wonderful conversation that I'm so happy we had the chance to talk this way.
I am too. I'm sorry.
You are one of my favorites. I said that at the beginning, and it's been a while. Yeah. And so, vielen Dank, many, many thank you. And all good things. The next time I'm in Austria, I'll let you know.
Please do.
I will do that.
You have a schnitzel and the beer.
I'll go straight to the strudel.
I don't do strudel. I do a schnitzel.
I'll make the strudel. You make the schnitzel.
Thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you, Barbara Daniels.
Okay.